Hi, I'm Debra Cooper. I'm a consultant at the California State Senate Office of Research. And I'm going to speak a little bit about my transition into science policy and what science policy actually means. So as a neuroscientist, I consider myself a brain nerd. And I actually believe I earned that title in elementary when I did a report on the brain. And from that point on, I was fascinated by anything and everything related to the brain. And the brain has been the one common thread that has been with me through all of my career aspirations and career shifts. While I was in graduate school studying neuroscience, as a brain nerd would do, I went to a few K through 12 outreach events and talked to students about the brain, about different aspects of the brain, the different parts, and what they do. Sometimes I would talk more specifically about my field of research, which was drug addiction, and talk about how drugs affect the brain itself. I continued these outreach efforts through my postdoc. And so here I am with a student from a Magnet Junior High School in Houston, Texas. And she's using an impaired driving simulator, which is an interactive computer program that mimics the effects of driving under the influence of different substances and consequences associated with it. While I was with my postdoc lab, we also went to a few community events. And so I was able to do brain outreach and drug addiction outreach to just about anybody and everybody. And so while doing all of these outreach efforts, I had two main takeaways. The first was that while I enjoyed science and I've always loved science, I realized that I like talking about science and the research that's being done a little more than I actually like doing the research itself, which was surprising for me because I considered myself a shy and quiet person. But when I'm talking about something that I'm passionate about, I can go on for days. The second takeaway was that while talking to these students and community members, I realized that there's a lot of misinformation about drug abuse and about mental health in general. And there's a lot of research that's being done that dispels these myths and these misinformation and that produces new and valuable information, but it's not necessarily always accessible to the lay public. And the data itself tell a story, but if the data are not accessed, it's a story untold. And so whether that's not knowing where to go to access the information or how to interpret the information, or even how that information is relevant to that person and their family and friends, it represents a gap in communication that's problematic. And this information is necessary for people to be equipped to make informed decisions about their health and their surroundings. And so these gaps in communication are issues that need to be addressed. So from realizing that I love talking about science to various audiences and that I want to be involved in the functional application of scientific research, I decided to make a career shift outside of academia. I considered a few different options, but narrowed my focus down to either science communication or science policy. And I was fortunate enough to be involved in academic programs that expose their students and trainees to career options outside of academia. And so while going to these events, I made a network of people who had non-academic careers. And while talking to them, I decided I wanted to pursue science policy. And before actually getting into science policy, I had a very vague idea of what science policy really means. And truth be told, now that I'm in it, I realized that that vague understanding was due to the fact that science policy can mean different things to different people just depending on your role in it. So for instance, a scientist can work in a policy role in the legislative branch of government. So as a legislative staffer, you'd be drafting and analyzing bills for an elected official. And so in this regard, you are finding relevant issue areas that need to be addressed, researching the information for that, drafting documentation to put in a bill form that can be used to address those policy gaps, and carrying that bill through to make sure that it is in the best shape to be passed into law and to benefit the people that it was meant to benefit. So as a legislative staffer, you would be working on both scientific and non-scientific issues. However, as an added benefit as a scientist, you'd be able to identify policy gaps that are related to the scientific field and able to research the relevant information for that policy gap. In addition, a scientist can be a lobbyist. So a lot of people have preconceived notions of what it means to be a lobbyist or what they do. But lobbyists are integral components to the legislative process. They work with the legislature on behalf of a company or an organization. And they work with the legislative staffers to help draft bills that benefit the people that they represent. Oftentimes, the lobbyists focus on a particular issue area and are therefore subject matter experts in that area. And some of these issue areas or the companies that they work for are scientific in nature. So this presents another avenue that a trained scientist can work in to influence policy. In addition, a scientist can be an advocate. And as an advocate, you'd be conveying relevant information to the legislature. As opposed to a lobbyist, you're not necessarily pushing bill ideas forward, but rather just exchanging information and increasing awareness for a particular issue area. Additionally, you can talk to the people that you represent and inform them about relevant policies or policy changes that can affect their life and their well-being. The word advocacy also means there are a variety of ways that a person can be an advocate. They can be an advocate as a dedicated role in a company or organization, but you can also be an advocate in academia while you're at the bench or working as a faculty member. Before I fully transitioned into science policy, I was part of the Washington Fellows Advocacy Program through the Professional Society ASPET, or American Society for Pharmacology and Experimental Therapeutics. This was a one-year fellowship program, and I was involved in this program while I was still a postdoc. At one point, I was taken to Washington, D.C. and was able to speak to congressional staffers on Capitol Hill and advocate on behalf of scientific funding. Additionally, scientists can work in the executive branch of government. And so these are different departments and agencies. So in California, for instance, I work very closely with the Health and Human Services Agency, which is just one of a number of agencies in the executive branch. So generally speaking, people in departments or agencies are creating regulations that are addressing bills that have been passed into law. So as a scientist in the executive branch, you would be implementing policy based on good and current science and good policy. Now, these are just a number of different roles that a scientist can do in science policies, and this is by no means an exhaustive list. I personally came into science policy through a science policy fellowship with the California Council on Science and Technology. This fellowship places 10 PhD level scientists in the California legislature each year. And so this is me with the 9 other fellows in my fellowship class. We're all placed as either personal staff in a legislator's office and draft bill ideas for the particular elected official, or we're placed in a Senate committee, which is a committee that focuses on a particular issue area, and we analyze bills in that particular issue area. I was placed in the California State Senate Office of Research. And this is the California State Capitol building, a building which I'm happy to say I get to work in every day. So in the Senate Office of Research, where I work, we can be thought of as a support staff for the state senators. We have a number of different roles, but one of our roles is to provide in-depth research for the staffers and for the senators and their staffers, which they can therefore use for drafting and analyzing bills or for putting together informational hearings. In addition, we also keep on top of policy changes that are happening on the federal level and relay that information to the relevant people at the state level. In that regard, we can be thought of as a conduit of information. And one of the most exciting parts of the job for me is that I'm always able to meet new and interesting people and learn new and interesting facts. So this is me with Senator Richard Pan. His district covers the area in California where I live and work. And not only is he an elected official, a state senator, but he's also a pediatrician. So he's found his own way of merging medical science and policy and politics. I was also able to meet and speak with Erin Brokovich, who is best known for her advocacy role for a small town in Southern California in regards to contamination in their drinking water. And her advocacy role for that town was later made into a movie titled Erin Brokovich. The discussion that day at the Capitol centered around water quality issues, environmental health, and policy recommendations to improve those. So this was just another way of branching multiple disciplines of science with policy. And as I stated before, there are a number of different ways that a person can be involved in science policy. And to determine how you want to be involved in science policy, the first thing to figure out is what is your overall goal that you're aiming for. Whether it's having daily and direct influence on policy and legislation, or interpreting policy so that it is effective in the most beneficial way to the general public, or just exchanging ideas between different audiences. In any regard, whichever path is chosen, the common thread is that it's an ongoing conversation in policy, including science policy. So in regards to science policy, it's an ongoing conversation between the scientist and the policymaker, or the scientist and the general public, or the scientist and any other audience. And at the end of the day, it's the scientist's role to equip their audience with the information that's necessary for them to make informed decisions for themselves or the groups that they represent. And this important information comes in the form of data and the research that's being done. And as I said before, the data itself tell a story, but it's my role as a scientist in policy to become the storyteller. Thank you.